The Rebel Capitalist Show.
All right, guys, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome someone back to the Rebel Capitalist Show. He is my good buddy and expert in many, many things. We're going to dive into a lot of topics today. Really needs no introduction. His name is Dr. Chris Martenson. Chris, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Hey, George. So good to be back here with you today.
So
what are we talking about today?
Here's first question. What did you learn from, we'll call it the cerveza sickness and everything that happened in the world 2020, 2021? So lockdowns, the mandates, all of the insanity. Because I was thinking about this the other day, and it's very true. If you would have told me at the end of 2019 that the world was going to look like it looks today, or 2020 for that matter, I would have told you that you're crazy. I would have said there's absolutely no way. There's zero chance of that. And then here we are in 2022, looking back, and now we talk about lockdowns as if it's like, oh yeah. Oh yeah, that country's locking down again. Okay, yeah, whatever. All right, kid, honey, you taking the kids to soccer practice tonight? Like, like that would have been completely mind-blowing in 2019. And it's not just that, but it's the whole disinformation and misinformation. I've tried to get my head around that, and all of this has come about or really came to the forefront in 2020, dealing with the cerveza sickness. So I wanted to start there. What have you learned? Like the top 3 things that you've learned about the world, yourself, society, etc., from this whole thing that we've dealt with since 2020?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah.
So, so number one, my number one learning, I'm going to quote Lily Tomlin, the comedian, who said, "As cynical as I am, I find it hard to keep up." And I learned that I was already pretty cynical about my fellow humans, at least at the institutional level. Let me be clear. I love people. I don't like groups of people. I just have trouble with big groups. And to your hat's point, I hate how the Fed, I'm sure individually they'd all be reasonable people, but as an institution, they've been absolutely failing us. And so I wasn't prepared for the level of failures that we actually saw and what those revealed. So the CDC still failing to this day in a way that's killing people. And they're doing it because they have a revolving door and they have conflicts of interest and they're stuck in a bureaucratic nightmare. And individuals there, I'm sure, are fine, but as an organization, number one learning was, when it really matters, you can't count on our organizations finally figuring out how to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So that was important to me, because somehow I think I always had a little hope in the back of my mind, that when push comes to shove, maybe the Fed will do the right thing, or the CDC or the NIH or the US government. And the answer is no, they won't, right? They're going to double down and triple down on doing the wrong things, because I don't know. We'd have to talk psychology. So that was one. 2 was the absolute ease with which whoever they are in this story, and we can have that conversation later, the ease with which they were able to manipulate people's opinions, beliefs, and emotions was astonishing to me.
Right.
I wouldn't have believed it. I mean, in 2019, I was pretty cynical, but I was not prepared, George, for the degree to which otherwise and often very otherwise intelligent people, highly educated and also maybe intelligent, because those two things don't necessarily go hand in hand, seem to have been some of the people who were the most taken over by whatever this mass psychosis, the programming, the next current thing. They were emotionally manipulated in ways that really was shocking to me, actually. So that was a big takeaway, is how easy it is to have people be manipulated.
Yeah, I remember listening to Tom Woods. You know Tom Woods? Yeah. You know Tom, don't you, Chris?
Yeah.
I remember listening to him back in the 2020, and he was talking about when they first did the lockdowns in the United States, it was just 2 weeks to flatten the curve or whatever. And he thought, and he has admitted that he thought there was no way it could possibly go past 2 weeks, because the American people just would not, they would protest. There would be civil disobedience. There would be social unrest. They just would not stand for this type of government intrusion in their personal lives. And then, 6 months later says, boy, I was sure wrong on that one.
Yeah, boy, I was wrong too. You know what they say? The hardest part of 2 weeks to flatten the curve is the first 685 days.
Yeah.
It gets easier after that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I cut you off there. I'm sorry. You're going to move on.
Yeah. Well, that was number two, is just, how easy people got manipulated and seem to love it. Actually, I know people who vigorously defend their right to be ignorant and remain ignorant because, as we talk about Cerveza and the Cerveza magic thing that you're given for it, right? The data is coming in, George, really bad right now, where there's no other way to parse it, but the people who got the magic stuff are doing worse now.
So walk me through that, Chris, because I haven't kept my finger on the pulse of what's going on there.
Yeah, there's a tale of two countries. We could look at South Africa and Portugal. Portugal went all in. They actually have a magic juice sort of proportion that's, I think, at like 118% compliance. And how's that?
Oh, yeah.
Because that's 2 plus the 3rd plus the 4th. So they're above, like they're completely covered. And then South Africa, they're like, not really. And you got like 13% or 15% compliance. So they're not into it. And they both have the same scariant variant. It's the BA4/5. And when you look at them, South Africa's current deaths from that are running at about 1/6 of the recent peak when Omicron first came through. And Portugal's running almost at the same exact height it had before. They have a death rate now that's as high as it's ever been practically. And it's higher than at any other point earlier. So how this should be simple. If this stuff works magically, what's going on? And of course, this was all easily predicted because these variants and this magic juice, they have nothing to do with each other. So they keep wanting to do more of the same. And it's inarguably in the data causing more harm now at this point in time. So this should be something as a society, as a culture, not just US, but I mean, cultures that got wrapped around this. This should be easy. You sit down, you look at the data. It's like if you had an investment portfolio and you're just like hemorrhaging week after week after week, eventually you go, maybe I should reconsider my strategy here, right? But we can't seem to do that around this thing. It's very hard. I don't understand that as a scientist. It's very confusing.
I wonder why the politicians, I mean, what's their incentive there? What's their motivation? Because, I refuse to believe they're too stupid to understand this. I don't think they're smart people for the most part, but to understand this, you don't need a 150 IQ. So, then you can say, well, they're manipulated by the global elite. Maybe to a certain degree. I get that, but it's just, the vast majority of them, it just seems we've seen this consistent ignorance for just basic data and analyzing facts when it comes to policy. So it's like, what's driving this? Is it just strictly narrative where they have to be on board with this narrative because the left, let's say, has adopted this narrative, and therefore, if you want to cater to those constituents, then you can't change your view. You have to be on team lockdown, or you have to be on team special medicine, or whatever, magic juice, or whatever you want to call it. And you can't vary at all without risking your political career. Is that what it's about?
I think so. I mean, we could analyze this a bunch of different ways, and we have to wonder, are we just looking at the failure of education comprehensively over time, or is it, we've seen a lot of the rise now of people in, we'll call it the woke culture, as sort of a gross amalgamation for all the people out there who think this way, which is very simply, I would say it's feelings matter more than data. Like there's information, but feelings actually take primacy in this story. So, and that comes with a whole wrapper of things. So I think what we're seeing is we've hit a critical mass of people at leadership positions who fundamentally don't know how to think anymore, really honestly, because that's really, it's that, can you let data drive your decisions, or are you going to let some social construct drive your decisions? And so it's really more about the ideology than it is about the facts of the matter. And so you asked me for three things, and my third thing is, I realized I was leaving some hope that humans were going to, like Hollywood style, rally to the story right at the end and figure stuff out. But I don't think so, and quick example by what I mean, it should have been immediately obvious, like it was to me, and I'm sure it was to you and many of your listeners, that not having fertilizer at the beginning of the planting season is a bad thing, right? It's not really that hard to resolve. Yields and fertilizer go hand in hand. And, while I have a government that can rally like this to hand out $48 billion in military hardware to Ukraine instantly, they couldn't figure out how to rally anything except late a few extra grants so farmers could go deeper in debt to maybe afford really ridiculously expensive fertilizer. Like, this should have been exactly flipped. Let's make Ukraine take out some loans to buy our hardware, and we'll give money to the farmers. It should have, but they didn't. And how could you not understand in this world, in this time, that having appropriate yields was going to be really important? And still to this day, people haven't wrapped their heads around it. And it's super simple to think through. But the feelings around supporting Ukraine took primacy over the feelings around supporting farmers, even though the facts of the matter, I think, would give you an exact opposite approach to that.
And also, is it because that's the only tool they have? And what I mean by that is they can print money, let's say, quote unquote. We'll use that term broadly, but they can't print fertilizer. And so is it because it's just easier to print money than it is to somehow do what is required to allow the producers to produce more fertilizer here, or for us to import it? What do you think about that theory?
Well, it really speaks to a kind of leadership that would be necessary. I think everything is so decentralized and, so centralized, but in a decentralized way. I don't think anybody actually feels like they have the authority at this point. Plus, we've packed people who just legit aren't up to the task. I mean, I don't know if you've seen her, but the energy secretary, I don't know that she even understands the first thing about, I don't know if she's even visited a drill pad in her life, or even knows what oil necessarily is made out of. We've got a transportation secretary who doesn't seem to understand transportation. So, I mean, there's just sort of this DC cronyism. So I think we have the wrong people in positions, but even with the right people, you would still have to be able to make the decision. Like, hey, you know what? I've made the decision. We need this over here, like a general or a field marshal might, in the heat of a battle, say, I have to make a quick decision without waiting for HQ to weigh in on this whole thing. I think we've lost the DNA for responding to rapidly emergent things. And so I think this is where we're finding out that we have a system that's tuned for the good times, but now we're coming into hard times. And I think we're just seeing how wanting that is, because it's unable to do anything other than exactly what it's been doing beforehand, even though now calls for all new reactions. Right.
Yeah, exactly. That's the key. And that's one of the problems that government and corporations, for that matter, getting so huge, is it's very difficult for them to navigate. That's one big edge those small businesses have, is they're far more agile and nimble in tough times. So let's go down that path. I mean, what do you see for the rest of 2022 and 2023 as far as the economy? And then I really want to take a deep dive into the food shortages, because I know that's something that you have a lot of expertise in. And I think that's something that's on everyone's mind, rightfully so.
Sure. And of course, food is our primary energy, but the primary energy of the economy is oil. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to talk to people about the oil situation. So George, I was actually writing about this in 2017. I had an article out. I just dragged it out for my readers the other day and said, hey, look, here's where I said we were going to have these troubles right around now. And it's not that I'm Nostradamus. It's that I saw this massive fall off in upstream oil and gas investment. It's a very capital intensive business. Right. It's constantly has a depleting reservoir of things that it can draw out. So it has to invest in new production. So irrespective of any other arguments about energy, whether we should be in alt energy, what people think of peak oil, all you have to understand is that when you see an industry underinvesting by 50% and it has a 5-year lag time, you can pretty much add up about 5 years out. You say, here's where we're going to have structural shortfalls in this commodity. Now, here's what I'm trying to educate people about, which I know you do a great job at, is oil isn't just another commodity. Like, hey, we're short on cotton, we'll use more nylon. It's not like that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's the master resource. And it's not just in, your gas tanks. That's where people think of it. It's not just in the planes. We can understand kerosene and jet fuel. It's 30% is in polyesters and resins and plastics.
Glasses, the frames of my glasses, absolutely everything.
It's absolutely everything, right? And so when you have a shortfall in that, the first thing you have to understand is, again, if we had that field marshal, maybe we could triage in a way that would be reasonable. What I'm trying to get people ready for is, because of the failings we've seen, no field marshals are on the scene, and we're not going to triage in ways that would make sense, right? We're going to triage by price, by availability. Who knows what's going to happen? But we have to be ready for the idea that less oil simply means less economy. And I think that's going to bite Europe hardest first. And it could be really bad, because it's not just like Europe's tottering at the edge of, some little precipice. They've got the, as bad as I hate the Fed, the ECB, woo, they really went on a print to press thon, right? So they've got this, massive overhang of financial excess and an energy shortfall. And I think that's a particularly volatile mix. And I think people need to be ready for that, because that, I think, is going to be particularly explosive through not just 2022, but I don't see this resolving even through most of 2023 at this stage.
Is there a difference between, because you said when energy declines, so does economic output, and that is absolutely 100% true. But what if we can still get the energy temporarily we need for the economy, or to even grow the economy, but it's at a much, much higher price? So I guess a better question would be, if the price of oil doubles, triples, is it even possible to grow the global economy, because that input that is so necessary is maybe potentially out of reach, although it may be available due to the price?
Yeah. Well, price and supply and demand all sort of make an equilibrium with each other. And so the supply side of this is pinched for a significant period of time. And if we just ignore price for a moment, my view is still that when you look at one of the best charts I have, just shows gross domestic product output of any given country on one axis, and the amount of oil they consume on another axis. And it's a little scattering of dotted line, dots that has like a really nice line, like super high correlation, like 0.95 or something, right? So that's just the nature of the beast. And of course we get that intuitively, right? Every time you're out on a packed highway, those are all units of economic activity all around you, doing whatever they're doing, right? So with that super high price, you're going to see fewer of those vehicles on the road. You'll see fewer things shipped. You'll see that because that's how price solves for a supply and demand mismatch, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly.
It's just a supply issue. That's the thing I've been trying to hammer home for people is, this is a supply issue. Tell me how wonkish you want to get. I can show you all the fields and where they're at. And of course the shale boys and girls, I'm so glad they got religion now, and that they're about saying, hey, we only have so much acreage. It's going to maximize shareholder profitability if we drill this at a responsible rate. And that's what they're doing now. And I think that's appropriate, right? I think that fiduciary responsibility ought to be part of this game again. And I'm astonished when you talk about really bad, like ignorant decisions, watching certain senators and Congress people come out and say, we should really put a windfall tax on those oil people because they're making money now. I'm like, well, did you see that they were losing money in 2015, 16, 17, negative ROE?
Right.
Was anybody calling for truing up the coffers of the oil company? No. I mean, it's the nature of the business. You have lean years and you have fat years. And if you say we're going to skim the fat years, you're just going to get lean years. That's how it works.
Do you think they believe that, Chris, or are they just trying to buy votes?
Yes to both.
Yeah.
Why not both? No, it's an election year. Anything goes, right? I mean, they're desperate at this stage. Anything. You watch them pile on around the school shootings. We've got this mysterious trans sets of issues going on, and you got the oil stuff. Whatever they can do, they know that consumers are feeling the pain. But I think consumers have started to figure out that the cause of that pain, increasingly people, George, in my sphere are saying they get it. This was a set of bad decisions by those same people in power who now want to try and fix it with more insane decisions on their part. So
yeah, and let me break that down just for the viewers and listeners, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think what you're saying is to fix a problem of consumer price inflation, or to fix a problem of high prices, you don't solve that with more currency units. You solve that with more supply. You solve that with more stuff. You solve that with more goods and services. Or in this case, you solve it with more oil. You don't solve it by giving people money to buy the oil that exists. That's the way to make the problem worse. So
yes.
that's what we're dealing with here. So when you see Elizabeth Warren, as an example, come out and say, "Oh, well, to solve this problem, since the oil companies are making so much money, we'll just go ahead and tax them, and then we'll take that tax and give it to the people to buy the expensive oil." You're creating more currency units on the balance sheets of those individuals that are going to travel velocity, and you're reducing future supply of oil because they're not going to have those profits to invest in more supply downstream or in the future. So so there really are, Elizabeth Warren, arguing for the opposite of what we would actually do if we wanted a real solution.
Yeah, exactly right. You got to. So this is how insane it is to me, because it's the oldest, most axiomatic thing in all of economics is that you want to see demand destruction. The cure for high prices is high prices, because demand gets reduced, but then producers are incentivized. Elizabeth Warren et al. Are going the other direction. They're going to try this new economic theory out, which is demand construction. Let's take money from here, give it to people so they can buy more and reduce output and hope prices go down. It's just
right there. Well said. You said it a lot better than I did. Yeah.
No, it's that silly. But we're all going to pay for it. So it's actually that serious too, unfortunately.
Yeah. And then that brings down global economic growth in a time where, we really need more of it. And, you look at those charts of population, the growth increase. And, another thing that people don't really understand, they get caught up in this conversation about renewable energy and how we need to replace fossil fuels. And I get it. I totally understand the argument. But what people don't realize is we don't need to, we can't just replace fossil fuels. We need the amount of energy we have access to growing. We need to be able to utilize more and more and more energy as the population grows. If we don't, then the standard of living per capita is going to go down. So we don't just need to replace the existing energy. We need to somehow produce more and more and more of it, or use what we have far more efficiently.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. And so the whole alternative energy argument, I find, is really a lot of weak thinking and hopium. I'm not averse to it, right? I've got an e-bike. I love my electric bike and put solar on. I'm totally a fan. But the idea that we're going to just put a few windmills up and some solar panels and somehow this all resolves itself without some serious investment and without some serious possible pain and adjustment process is magical thinking. And that's the part I don't like. And very serious people come up with this magical thinking. The Rocky Mountain Institute, they put out these 50-page things. They're like, look, producers produce all these cars and now we're all not using oil. And I'm like, dudes, have you called the lithium producers up? Just call them up. Just talk to them real quick. Right. So it's very much not connected to what I would call reality, which is time, scale, cost. We can do all this. It's going to be really expensive. It's going to take a long time, and we may or may not have the resources available. So we're going to have to adjust, a little bit. And people aren't, I don't think, really ready for that. But even with that, again, we're missing it when we think that this is all about moving us. It's all about electric cars. It's not. It's about the nitrate fertilizers, the phosphate fertilizers. It's about all the plastics, the resins, the input pieces. There's a lot of critical things contained in the oil story that most people are unaware of. And then it gets even more complicated when you understand there's different grades of oil and types, and they have different uses, and they have different refineries, and they give you different outputs. And it's very complex, and it's developed over the last 150 years. And all of a sudden, Europe said, we don't want any of that Russian oil. It's like, where are you going to find 4 million barrels per day of Urals grade oil? Just somewhere on the market? It's just somewhere. I think there's going to be some learnings on that one. It's going to be kind of painful, but This is where we learn how important energy is. And if we were being serious, George, we would use the remaining oils that we've got, and we will anyway, but we should use them to figure out how we're going to transition to whatever this next thing is. If it was on me, magic wand, we're pouring as much into figuring out thorium electric reactors as a fuel cycle as we do bailing out AIG or, bailing out mortgage-backed security companies, right? We should really be pouring huge amounts in, and I think we will, but not until potentially it's a little bit late in the game.
Is nuclear part of the solution?
Yes, no question.
Okay.
Not the old Westinghouse Mark V, boiling reactors, the kind that melted down in Fukushima and they're building in Georgia. That stuff, those are crazy, super expensive, old technology. There's new second, third, fourth gen nuclear technology, some of which I'd have in my backyard. I'd sign right up. A little, Connex style trailer with a pebble bed reactor in it that will make, reliable energy for 40 years. I'd be like, yeah, I'll put it right here. So I think that's a good approach. And then thorium I mentioned is a entirely different fuel cycle. And we had the first reactors for that in the United States, built in Oak Ridge in the late 50s. So people are like, how would we do that? I don't know. Like, we already did it once, and I think material science is better. So we would figure it out again, but China's doing that. India's doing that. And if we were doing that, I'd feel a lot more positive about this, but we're putting money into windmills and solar, which again, there's only so much of that you can do without a storage technology because, well, nighttime and calm days, right? It's just the reality of it that is mysterious that we're not taking it more seriously at this point.
And you know what Art Berman always talks about when I discuss this with him is how much of the fossil fuels go into the production of those windmills and the renewable energy in and of itself. He was talking about being on the site of one of these big windmill farms that you see driving to California, something like that. And he said that there were literally hundreds of diesel trucks like on the on the site building the thing. So you can't just, he says, you've got to understand this, and that's got to be part of your solution, and you've got to be cognizant of this in order to have an adult discussion of the costs, the benefits, and how we're going to get from A to B.
Yeah. And I love Art for that pragmatic realism. Of course, you're talking to a guy who spent decades in and around the business and he knows it intimately. And he's been on the drill pads and he's gotten his hands dirty. So he understands the business really well. And things don't just magically happen in his world. Hard work and capital and energy come together to create something. And so you look at a wind tower, it has like a 100,000 pound base, out of concrete. Where'd the concrete come from? It came from this plant where they cooked it using, cooked the lime using natural gas. What about the rebar steel in it? Well, that came from the steel plant where they used coking coal and right. There's everywhere you look, there's a fossil fuel input embedded silently in there, or maybe not so silently, all those workers. Where did the food come from that they ate? And was it fertilized with stuff that can't, everywhere you look, there's a fossil fuel finger on that story, and that's fine. But it would be naive or not adult to think, well, when the time comes, we'll just have the windmills spin and take the output from that, and we'll just create more windmills with that output, right? Yeah. We haven't done that yet. We have this many examples of building alternative energy rebuildables, as Nate Hagen called them, not alternative energy, rebuildables. We haven't rebuilt one of them with the output from its own energy creation, and that'd be an interesting experiment to run, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think that would probably surprise a lot of people just to see it, think about it through that lens. Well, let's talk about food, Chris, because this is something that my good buddy Chris McIntosh was talking about probably in 2019 about how he wasn't predicting the cerveza sickness, but he was saying that, hey, even if we go down this path with what governments are doing, we're going to have restricted food supply, so prices most likely are really going to go up. And tell me, like, how this global supply chain of food, I guess, why is it being disrupted right now? Why are there shortages? Let's just start at a basic level, and then let's try to think through how this is going to impact the developed countries, let's say the West, the United States, Japan, and then how this may affect the emerging markets. And then I'd also like to try to discuss what would be optimal for people to make sure that they're covered as far as their food needs here in the United States, and then maybe other people like me that have the ability to go to another country like, say, Colombia, and how their food needs are provided at a much more local level. So I kind of want to go into all of that. So I guess let's start by going over what the problem is right now, just at a basic level.
Yeah, the problem is we were going to run into this sooner or later, as a species. Every year when you look at global world food production, which is basically grains, so like we can track those, right? So how much wheat, corn, rice, et cetera. And then you look at the supply demand, it's razor thin. Every year, we're growing a little bit more and population is growing, so demand is going up. And so it's usually only a 2 or 3% margin. It's not a lot, right? And most people don't know this, but we usually only have maybe 4 to 6 months of food on hand for the whole world, meaning we need the next harvest to come in good. So when you have something that thin, all it takes is a couple of years of short and you run into some trouble. Now, 2020, we came into some serious short and we ate into a lot of reserves at that point in time because a lot of places, just like every other business, got a little pinched and things didn't quite happen and there weren't field hands. Remember, I don't remember, but March of 2020, they needed like 400,000 people to come into the country from across the southern border to plant everything, right? Mostly in the Central Valley. And of course you couldn't because nobody was, all the borders were locked down and farmers were scrambling. It was a huge thing. So it was very easy to know that sooner or later that was going to ripple through and create some difficulties. So we ate into the stockpiles we had. And so we came into 2022 a little thin, not bad, but a little thin. Then all of a sudden, well, we have some legit weather issues this year, that's for sure. But the fertilizer issue is the big one. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine really didn't help either. So that's kind of a triple whammy. So it's no one factor, it's all of them together. Out of them, I would say, George, the most avoidable and probably the most damaging was the lack of fertilizer getting on fields in time. So here in the US, the winter wheat, the spring wheat, didn't get fertilizer on it until late. And if you don't get it on at just the right time in the growth cycle, the overall plant is stunted and the amount of proteins that is a lot less in it. So both the quantity, we're getting lower yields, but the quality are both diminished in that respect. So that's sort of the big global backdrop, just a variety of things. And the weather has not been all that cooperative here in our hemisphere. Russia's had great weather, though. I think they're going to have a really good harvest this year. So
ironically enough, right? Were we headed for a problem with fertilizer prior to Russia invaded Ukraine, or is that exclusively the reason?
No, our first fertilizer plants in Europe and then in the United States were already pinching supply due to explosive natural gas prices. I haven't checked today, but last I saw in the US, natural gas was vaulting over $9.30 a therm. We haven't been there since briefly in 2008. Like, it's a really high price here, but in Europe, it was twice that. So the fertilizer plant said, we have contractual outputs and our inputs are more than our outputs could be. So it doesn't make sense. So they declared force majeure or otherwise just shut down and said, doesn't make sense to continue operating. That would have been the right time for the government to step in and say, no, you should keep operating. How do we work this out? Right. But they didn't. So that ammonia-based or the nitrogen-based fertilizer was already in deep trouble. Then out of the phosphorus, decent amounts of that in the world, but China's a big exporter of that. And of course, they shut down big time around Shanghai and all of that because of COVID, that pinched supplies. And then it's the potassium, the K, and out of the NPK, that part, Belarus and Russia together are the number 1 and 2 exporters of that stuff. So we suddenly were without not just 1, not just 2, but in some cases, all 3 of the primary main fertilizer inputs. So that, again, in the growth cycle, for farming, when you put it on is really critical. And in many cases, we missed the window. So just what happened. All of a sudden, then you started to see some other local effects, which included India, which is a huge producer of wheat, but they shut down their wheat exports and their sugar exports. They're big on both of those. And now there's concern that they might shut down their rice exports because they're going to do what they need to do to make sure that if your export markets are open, you're now subject to world pricing of those commodities. And if you lock those, now you're subject to local pricing. So India couldn't afford to see what's happening in Sri Lanka or see what's happening in other places where they get those food riots, because all of a sudden their local population, like they see in Turkey, 91% year over year increase in food pricing, right? Creates social unrest. It's not fun. So we're going to see more and more of that provincialism as states lock down their exports. And that's really the larger context for what's happening globally.
Right.
US, but this is a train I've been on for a long time, George, which is I think everybody should plant a garden or get to know a farmer or really support local agriculture as much as you possibly can, because that's the direction all of this is going over time anyway.
Yeah. So that protectionism, for lack of a better word, where they just start banning exports to make sure they've got enough local supply to avoid the social unrest. How will that affect the United States? How will that affect Americans? Will we see food shortages, or will we just see higher and higher food prices because we aren't able to export those things? Or are we going to be fine because we can produce all that stuff right here in the United States?
We're blessed. We have more than we're a heavy duty food exporter. So at any point in time, if we needed to, we could always just reserve some of that. But we are very exposed on the international market. So we're going to see a lot of food price inflation that will continue. And I don't think, you and I know how this is going to go, right? People are going to get, hungry, and they're not going to be able to afford food. So we'll have a government program, and we'll give people more money to buy more food. And, I think that's where this is going to go. But we're still
going to see global prices, because the US can afford it because we're the world reserve currency. So we can give the stimmies, but the other countries can't give the people the stimmies. So the price goes up globally. The US can still afford to buy it because all we need are the dollars. We don't have to produce anything to get those dollars. We can print them. And then you get this catastrophe outside the United States, and it's a big problem, but at least we can suck up all that food because we can print the dollars.
Yeah. And in many respects, George, the story of exported food is really you're exporting water, right? A ton of wheat takes about 1,000 tons of water to grow, right? Hopefully most of that falls out of the sky's rain, but so near term, this year, next year, I think the US may be higher prices. I'm not worried about shortages here yet.
Okay.
I have another concern though, which is that we have this mega drought, which I just put together a whole report on this. Will come out in next week, I think sometime. But you look at where we are in the Southwest, we have this 1,200 year drought. It's just like ridiculous. It's pretty bad. Everybody's heard about Lake Mead and all of that. But what fewer people know about is that 1/6 of the world's grains are grown on top of what's called the Ogallala Aquifer, which sits below 6 or 7 states out there, Western Kansas and all of that. That water's pumped out and it grows a lot of the world's grains. I mean, 1/6, it's an astonishing amount. And that aquifer has just been getting hammered and lower and lower. In some cases, it's dropped 100, 150 feet, right? So we know we can't keep doing that forever. And so over the next few years, particularly if this drought doesn't relent, right? And I hate to put it this way, but the best thing that could happen right now would be the Gulf of Mexico warms up. You get a nice kind of a Cat 1 hurricane, and it blows up and in and drops a lot of rain, because we need a lot of rain in that part of the country to begin correcting what's going on there. But if it doesn't, George, in the next 2, 3, 4 years, we're going to they're already starting to limit, if not stop, putting the water onto certain fields. And that includes the Central Valley of California, where, something ridiculous, 30-40% of the nation's produce is growing there. And already that's really, really pinched from this drought. And we have the grain growing up top the Ogallala Aquifer. That's really pinched at this point. So those are some longer term things that are coming. And I'm really concerned about that drought and those 40 million people who live downstream of Lake Mead's output. It's a big story that's going to be developing unless something really dramatic happens weather-wise.
How does it work in a country, Chris, like and maybe I'm just naive. I don't know. Let me tell you a story. When I'm in Medellin, and most people know I spend quite a bit of time there, there's a lake about maybe an hour, hour and a half drive called Guadape. And I've driven up there a few times. And when you drive up there, it's, you know, it's very, these back roads. It's not like you're taking I-10, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it's all these windy
Yeah.
roads up to the mountain. You know how it is.
Yeah.
And the last probably 45 minutes of the drive, it's non-stop of like farms with and they're all out on the street, you know, with the tourists drive by, or the people driving by going to the lake and coming back. And it's all of, they've got all of this, it looks like a farmer's market, but it's just mile after mile after mile after mile. Every single corner you go around, there's more and more of these fruits and vegetable stands. And it's like a Whole Foods, for heaven's sakes. They've got honey, they've got, I mean, they've got meats, they've got everything you could possibly imagine. And it's just, I would assume, kind of the excess that these local farmers are growing that they just sell to the people that are kind of driving by on their way from Medellin to the lake and whatnot. And then I've also chartered a helicopter. It's a great place to go spend a day. And sometimes I don't like to drive, so I'll charter a helicopter to go from Medellin to the lake. And it's just a quick 20-minute flight. But you're flying over everything and you're seeing all, I mean, every single little plot of land is growing stuff, you know? So in my mind, I've told myself, okay, well, if there is a problem with food, this is a good place to be, because there's so much of this stuff that's just grown locally. And I would assume that that's what's coming down into Medellin and they're using in the restaurants, you know, for the most part. Is that the way it works? Or am I just kind of trying to rationalize it just to make myself feel better? give me some truth serum here.
Okay. Hold on one second, George. I'm getting some feedback from our system here.
Oh,
Got
sure.
it. So, you know, I'm fond. So this is why I keep encouraging people. I say, you know, go out and support your local farmers. Go out and do what you can. Stop at those roadside places. Anywhere in town, there's going to be somebody, and particularly young people are coming on who are really passionate and they want to grow stuff. And this was explained to me by a guy named Woody Tash at this thing called Slow Money. We're talking about how does local agriculture get started. And he said, most people get it backwards. They think, well, we'll start growing something, right? And then we'll figure it out. And he said, it's exactly backwards. Demand creates supply. So if people start demanding local produce, the supply will show up magically. It's called economics, right? It's amazing. So I love hearing that there are lots of people with excess supply and all of that, but obviously there's still some demand for it too. And so this is the part of the story we got to really get our arms around is figuring out how to create more and more of that local.
But are there areas, Chris, that and my main question there is it true that the majority of the food for that area is possible to be grown locally, or am I just seeing that they're still importing all of their food from the United States or something like that?
Oh yeah.
Or are there areas where they are sourcing the majority of their food within a 5-mile radius, you know, cities and places throughout the world?
You know, it's not unlike the energy conversation. So you have to ask, do you see the base load calories? So the base load calories in any area would be the grains or potatoes. It's your starches, right? Of some kind. So if you come along and you see a lot of arugula and we've got some asparagus, you know, we're not really, no, we're not there. You're still importing basically a lot of the food because humans need, I'll make a number up, 2,000 calories a day, kind of average.
Right.
To persist. So the question is, are the local farmers producing their daily 2,000 calorie per day requirement plus surplus on top of that? And the answer for most countries is no. A lot of the base load calories come from those giant 3,000 acre spreads in Brazil and the United States and Ukraine. Yeah, that's really where the base load still comes from for the most part.
So if you were looking for a country, if you're one of your number one priorities was having access to food and not having to be concerned with that at all, what would you look for in a local area?
Water. For starters, it's all about the water. If you can, dry land farming is a really bad sort of a proposition. So if you have to irrigate, you're going to get in trouble sooner or later anyway, right? The water will dry out. You're going to salinate your fields over time because surface water, it's got salt in it. Rainwater. So for me, my personal litmus test is, do you have 30 inches of rain coming out of the sky every year, or more, right? That would be part one. Part two is you do want to see that there is already an endemic local farming tradition and community there, because it's not something you just sort of learn real quick. It takes generations to get it right. Here's like, if you were looking, the smartest thing you could do is just follow where the Amish or the Mennonite have gone. They have just ungodly great abilities to sort of read the tea leaves and get out of Dodge and move to new countries, right? They moved from Germany, they came to Pennsylvania and all over the United States and Michigan and all that. About 20 years ago, they started moving down to Paraguay. And I
didn't know that.
No, so wherever they go, you can be pretty sure the soil, water, the climate, and they're going to bring generations of farming capability. So again, it's just quick and easy. You could do worse than to figure out where are the Amish and the Mennonite setting up, because wherever they set up, the soil's good, the water's good, and it's a go.
Boy, that was a really cool fact. That's a value bomb right there for everyone. Well, I've never heard of that. I doubt the viewers and listeners have heard of that as well. So I'm gonna have to look into that. That's a piece of very cool advice. So I want to now move on to kind of economics and macro topics, because I know recession is kind of on everyone's mind right now. I've been talking about that a lot. We have the inversion of the yield curve. You had a negative GDP print of 1.5%, I think Q1. And you've got the Fed, in my opinion, they're kind of raising rates, but they know they can't raise rates too much or they're going to really crush the economy. So they've got to talk tough, like Paul Volcker, and just act like Ben Bernanke, to try to get the stock market down in an orderly fashion, try to reduce aggregate demand to a point that kind of brings down the CPI to a palatable level. So I think they're intentionally bringing down the stock market. They're trying to. So, if we go into a recession, I'm trying to figure out the odds and the probabilities, but then you combine that with these high energy prices. And I looked at a chart the other day. When oil spikes up and gets to, let's say over $100 a barrel, inflation adjusted, quite often you get a recession, but it's not every time. What I noticed is that when it really goes up dramatically and very, very quickly, that's when you tend to get a recession that comes, in the next, call it 6 to 12 months. So I'm sure you've done a lot of research on that. So is it the oil price is going up? What are the variables that we should look for that would substantially increase the probabilities of us going into recession above and beyond the other macro factors that I discussed as it pertains to the price of oil?
Yeah, good conversation. I've been chewing on it a lot. So oil is my number one go-to indicator. It's not just the price, but it's the pace of change. It's what they say about falling out of a plane. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the hitting the ground, right? It's the pace of change.
Yeah.
That gets you, right? So it's always what I'm looking for is that oil price shock, because when you get that shock, people don't have time to adjust. And if you're in a business, you're one of those midstream, value add companies, often your choices include just not doing business, right? I mean, you have to find a way. If you can't afford that oil price shock, by the time you figure out how to adapt, you've found out you've had to skinny operations down. That's one. But we live in a super financialized economy right now. And so the Fed balance sheets and all the other balance sheets are proxies for me. But the one thing I track is what's called the credit impulse. That's what's the pace of change. Again, it's the pace of change, not the absolute amount or even the relative amount, but what's the rate of change compared to a prior period of the amount of new credit, because credit is the lifeblood of the economy. That's the nature of the whole thing.
Right.
And so I tracked it for a while. The guys at Saxo Bank do a really good job of tracking it. It kind of fell off my radar because it was nothing to track for the past 4 or 5 years. Like, woo, it's going crazy. Well, that's back on my radar screen. The credit impulse is now deeply negative. And so that's something that I think is, once you, and I know you do and your listeners do, once you understand the role of credit in an economy, you understand that a contraction in that credit is always axiomatically negative GDP. Even holding it steady, if you said we had 10% growth in credit last year and we have 10% this year, Steve Keen does a great job. He's got this spreadsheet I dug through where he shows that if you just have flat growth, like credit still went up 10%, but it's the same 10% it went up last year, that itself is GDP negative. So in a positive credit impulse society, you need constantly expanding levels of credit on a percentage amount in order for that to be GDP positive. Otherwise, just by math, it's GDP negative. So that's something that's should be pretty high on your radar screen right now. It's for your listeners. It's very steeply negative in a way it hasn't been in quite a while.
Yeah, and I want to clarify because I think people's default when they hear an expansion of credit is just to think, well, people are spending more on their credit cards. They're just consuming more, and that's bad. Not necessarily. When we're talking about expanding credit, most of that, you look at the global economy, that's going to produce more goods and services. So that means those businesses aren't expanding or aren't taking on more debt to hire more workers, to build more factories, to produce more widgets. It's not just a component of, oh, well, we need more credit expansion so all these Americans can go out and just consume more. It's not really what we're talking about.
No, this is macro credit. So this is the very engine of the entire world economy, and it's either expanding or contracting.
Yeah, and that goes back to the Eurodollar system. I was doing a whiteboard video on that. How with Snyder, he talks about how it broke down in 2007, and I was looking at a chart of the bank reserves held at the Fed, and it just hit me because you look at the reserves that the banks had going back to 1987, it's about 60 billion with a B. Go to 2007, right before the GFC, it was about 40. So it went down actually by $20 billion. But we know that global GDP just pretty much went exponential. Global dollar supply went exponential. So how did that happen? How did that expansion of credit occur? Well, it happened on the balance sheets of the banks in the Eurodollar system. And so then those balance sheets contracted in 2007, the GFC, and then the Fed's balance sheet basically plugged the hole. They had to do quantitative easing, take all those reserves up to 3 trillion after QE3. Recently, it got up over 4 trillion for bank reserves. So the problem with that is, yes, they were able to kick the can down the road, but now you've got 4 of the 8 cylinders running on the Fed's balance sheet, which is pretty much central planning, compared to all 8 cylinders running on the free market prior to 2007. And as we go into the future and the Fed has to do more and more and more of this quantitative easing and make up for the lack of credit creation, dollar credit creation by the Eurodollar system, I think global growth continues to grind lower and lower and lower, which is exactly what we've seen since 2009. We still had global growth. We still had growth in the United States, but it was dramatically lower. Do you have any thoughts on that, Chris?
Yeah, and I'm going to tie I love the way you frame that. And I'm going to just tie it back again to oil. I can't find anything constructive in the oil story that says where we're going to get more quickly at this point. Even if the shale play, which could be a swing producer, the Wall Street Journal had this brilliant article about February, I think. And they said, wow, we ran an analysis, added it all up. And if all the shale companies started drilling into their tier 1 acreage to expand like they were in the heydays, right? Blowing out production by 30% a year increases, right? They would have about 3 years left of acreage and then they're out. And otherwise the companies can actually sit there and be more cautious and drill into it and keep production flat. And then they've got a decade or 2 left, right? And so that's obviously the more responsible thing to do. I don't know, short of nationalizing the oil business, George, and forcing them, I don't know that you could get them to be different than they are. So they're not going to be the swing producer stepping in. I'm really confused by whatever Saudi Arabia is up to, but they're not taking Biden's phone calls and they're talking to Xi, they're talking to Putin, but they're not answering to our calls anymore. So Biden's calls to like quick, OPEC produce more. It's not happening. So I still can't find anything constructive in that story, but I think you're right. The Federal Reserve is going to do what it knows how to do. And it's going to try and print more. It's going to expand reserves. It'll have to. It'll get scared at some point. The stock market will go a little too far. Maybe they'll do what Yellen said. They'll buy stocks directly. But anyway, they're gonna try and inflate that again.
Right.
But this time into a world with almost no or even negative growth, just due to the energy story. That's stagflation writ large. It's going to really hurt a lot of people. And the political calculus of that is going to become more and more painful over time. I'm starting to see people start to push back and not treat the Fed with such deference and kid gloves. And, oh my gosh, the Oracle spoke,
Right.
They're starting to get a little cranky about all this, and they're figuring it out. And so I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I welcome it because
in that world, do you think we get price controls, Chris?
Yeah, they're going to try price controls again. Not because it's the right thing to do, but it's something
politically palatable, and it makes it seem like they're quote unquote doing something. But then, correct me if I'm wrong, that's going to make the energy and the food crisis even worse.
Yes, it will. It will. Yeah. So I do think, again, we discover that socialism is a weak idea run by weaker people. And it always, to them, seems magical. You just need to take from these people so that these people can feel better, and somehow both parties end up impoverished. It's a mysterious thing. I guess we're going to learn it again.
Yeah. How much of what we just talked about do you discuss on your website? And can you walk us through how people can find out more about what you do? And I know you go into these deep dive discussions. I think I did a live stream with you for your members. Can you tell us all about that? Because what you discuss, I think, is just vitally important for every American, pretty much everyone in the West, to really understand well throughout the rest of the 2020s.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that, George. So at Peak Prosperity, I've got a bunch of free content. I do these weekly updates on YouTube as well. But for people who like to go a little deeper, we have our information scouts who that's what I am. I'm an information scout. I scour the internet all day, every day, just so that other people don't have to. And then I do even deeper dives for people who understand that they need community at this point in time. Right. Like it's not about the information. It's about who do we know and what are we doing? And for those, we call those our insiders. So it's more about the tribe. And so that's what we're trying to foster. We've got a great event coming up here in September where we're going to bring people to my little farmette here and talk about the things we need to talk about. Maybe our phones will be in Faraday cages, whatever, but we're going to have the conversations we ought to be having. And it's all about that for me at this stage. It's just, I'm just, George, I really want to help people. I just don't want people to get hurt by what's coming. And I might be wrong, but I'm not confused. I really see a world of hurt coming. So I think there's lots that can be done about that. So that's what Peak Prosperity is. It's about being resilient and figuring out what we need to figure out.
It sounds so ridiculous and so simple, but I think one of the biggest edges people can have right now, as far as maintaining their, not just surviving, but kind of thriving and maybe even building wealth, if you want to look at it from a standpoint of your portfolio, is just knowing what you don't know. And there's so many people out there that have, they just have no clue what they don't know. I mean, we go back to 2007. We hindsight being 2020, we say, Mike, how could you not see that? How can you? They didn't know what they didn't know. That yes, housing prices can come down, and yes, this Eurodollar system can fail, and now I think we're living through that same time when you've got kind of some dark clouds on the horizon, but a lot of people just have their head buried in the sand. Unbelievable.
Yeah. I just, in closing, obviously there's some countries that get this. I really think China gets it. This next decade or two, you could do worse than to understand it belongs to those who have access to the commodities and the resources they need to keep their economies functioning smoothly. And we've got so many stories. You want to talk indium? We got a story. Silver, there's a story. You want to talk about cobalt? There's a story. I mean, everywhere I turn, George, there's a story, not of like outright shortage. We all, that's it, but it's increasingly of limiting supply. And there's going to be intense competition for those resources. And so how you position for those competitions, I think to me, there's a huge story just on commodities. So pendulum swings. We went from fascination with paper. It'll swing back. There'll be fascination with things again, and hard assets and all of that. And let's just hope that we don't have a country that decides to seize and otherwise co-opt those assets, because that's what they tend to do.
Yeah, but the point is if you follow Chris's work, you're going to be you're going to be as prepared as possible for that pendulum swinging and whatever the government does. So that's why you got to check out Peak Prosperity. And Chris is going to be talking at Rebel Capitalist Live. So I cannot wait for that. We'll probably get him up there doing a panel discussion as well. That's in Miami, June 24th through the 26th. So you can get your tickets for that at rebelcapitalistlive.com. Chris, great conversation. As always, I appreciate your time, buddy.
Thanks, George. I appreciate it too.
Hello, fellow Rebel Capitalists. Do you enjoy watching these interviews I do for the Rebel Capitalist Show? Well, if so, you would absolutely love Rebel Capitalist Live. This is the conference I do twice per year, and we've had speakers like Robert Kiyosaki, Lynn Alden, Rick Rule, Jeff Snyder, and Dr. Ron Paul, just to name a few. So go to rebelcapitalistlive.com and check out the next event we have scheduled in Miami.